Welcome to Going Off-World, your gateway to the cosmos beyond our Earth. Join us as we embark on this journey together to the Moon, Mars, Venus, and beyond.
Welcome to episode 3 of Going Off-World. I'm your host, Steve Fisher. Today, we're exploring Mars, sustainability in space, and the future of space science with Dr. Tanya Harrison, a planetary scientist whose passion for space began at age 5 and led her to work on multiple Mars rover missions, including Curiosity, Perseverance, and Opportunity. From discussing how Mars lost its atmosphere to exploring what it takes to create sustainable settlements beyond Earth, Tanya shares fascinating insights about our planetary neighbor and why understanding Mars is crucial to humanity's future. As the founder of Earth and Planetary Institute of Canada, also known as EPIC, she's working to bridge the gap between scientific research and real-world impact. Whether you're curious about what happened to Mars' oceans, how we'll sustain human life on other planets, or how anyone can get involved in space exploration, regardless of their background, you won't want to miss this conversation. Join us on this journey where the sky is not the limit and the stars are just the beginning. Welcome to the podcast. Nice to have you on, Doc. I like to call you Doc, everyone doctor. So, a good way to start this is always, the people that don't know you to kind of go into your background. Can you share a bit about that and, what inspired you to pursue a career in planetary science? I think your story is really compelling.
Sure. My career has kind of been all over the place, but I have been really focused on wanting to work in space since I was about 5 years old. Thanks to a lot of influences, but mostly things like Star Trek: The Next Generation, because that started when I was pretty young, and the book The Magic School Bus: Lost in the Solar System. But it wasn't until 1997, when the Pathfinder mission landed on Mars, that my interest went from kind of space in general to Mars specifically. NASA released an animated GIF of images that Pathfinder took of the tiny little Sojourner rover driving off the lander platform and onto the surface of Mars. And this was a huge deal at the time. Like, animated GIFs were not a thing all over the internet, obviously. Pathfinder was the first mission that even had a website, which is mind-blowing to think about now. But seeing this little animation, I thought, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. I have to work on Mars rovers. And so, kind of fast forward, after my master's degree, I ended up working in mission operations for cameras on a few different missions, including Curiosity, Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, Perseverance, and Opportunity. Then I ended up kind of pivoting a little bit into the commercial space sector, first working at Arizona State University for something called the New Space Initiative, where their goal was to link academia, industry, and government in Arizona mostly to do engineering and science development for missions, instruments, things like that. And through that role, we were interfacing with a lot of new space companies somewhat early in the new space industry in terms of, if you went out and asked people, what companies could you name? Probably the only ones that would come to mind would be SpaceX, Virgin Galactic, maybe Blue Origin, for people that are kind of more in the know. So it was a great way to survey the landscape and see, this is like 2016, what was going on at the time, what companies were doing what, who seemed like they were legitimate, who were just people with a lot of money and an idea, but maybe didn't have anything to execute on it yet. And through that, I got connected with planets, and I ended up kind of shifting away from Mars and focusing on Earth. So I came in as their head of science strategy, first focused on federal researchers, and then eventually expanding to the global research community. And now I'm working in another position with kind of trying to do this linkage again of not academia, but researchers, industry, and government, again, for innovation in this new space sector.
Wow, that's quite a journey. A few things to kind of link into. I mean, Next Generation, I grew up with the original series with my father, watching it with my dad. And of course, TNG, for those who were Star Trek fans, that was a profoundly new show because it was the first that, really brought back, there were there were movies, but a new cast and a lot of new adventures. And, it definitely sparked a lot of people's interest in outer space and just in general. I think the space industry at that time was very quiet. There wasn't a lot happening. There's shuttle missions, but it wasn't just part of there isn't a lot of excitement. It's funny you mentioned the Mars rovers. What was the one that was, I would say in 2010, what was the big one? Was it Curiosity? Was that the one with the big cameras? What was the one operating in 2010? The one that went on forever?
Oh, that was Opportunity.
Opportunity.
Yeah.
I was at a conference in Seattle called Nomedex. It was once a year. And the person who drove that rover was speaking and shared a photo of the first view of Earth, from another planet. Like it was the view of Earth it was just incredible. Just see the sun, to see the Earth, the first view of Earth from another planet, the first photo of Earth from another planet. It was very profound. And I was just, I'll never forget seeing that. I can see why your passion is there, because that's where we're headed to many planets. We're hopefully to be a multi-planetary species. Your experiences in your personal and professional, how they shaped your vision for the future of space exploration.
It's a big question.
Yeah, I like big questions. It's a lot of ways to go, a lot of directions to go in.
I feel like my visions have shifted over time as I've gotten older and gotten more experience in different areas. So I really am appreciative of the fact that, I didn't just go in and stick in one very specific career the whole time I've been in space. It's given me an appreciation for, some of the things that government does really well, some of the things that research does really well, some of the stuff that commercial sector does really well, because they've all got their pros and cons. I think my biggest view for the future is all of those groups working together to try to push forward a really, innovative and inclusive future for all of humanity. We have a really great opportunity here to be very intentional about the way that we decide to do these things. So how are we going to explore? What are the priorities that we have? Where do we want to go? How can we do it sustainably so that we don't just kind of end up in a situation where we're traipsing around the solar system and wrecking places as we go, and then suddenly we can't live there anymore and we got to go to the next place. So really thinking about what does it mean to bring as many voices to the table as possible to think about, what is sustainability? What are the priorities that we should have as a species as we expand beyond the Earth, beyond just what, a scientist might think the priorities are for the moon, or what a commercial company that's interested in, mining helium-3, or, a philosopher or somebody that studies cultural history around what different people in history have thought about the moon. Getting all those people together to think about hey, this is a massive step for our species. We should really think about how we're going to do this.
That's great. Well, that leads us to the creation of Epic. So let's talk about that. Where did that or the incubation of that, where did that come from? And, as you're building this out, what's the mission and the vision for this? Explain obviously what it stands for, but yeah, kind of give people a background around that would be great.
Yeah. So EPIC is the Earth and Planetary Institute of Canada. And the goal is, there's 3 different goals. There's the subversive goal of trying to create more jobs for scientists, particularly in Canada, because we have a big brain drain problem with people getting degrees in many fields, but in this case, Earth and planetary related sciences. And then they end up going to places like the United States because there's a lot more opportunities there when it comes to the space sector and climate technology and stuff like that. So I wanted to help support the Canadian new space sector and climate tech, while also trying to kind of change the success metrics by which we measure science. And this was
Mm.
kind of inspired by some of the work that I did at Planet with some of our external collaborators. We had a case in early 2020, like shortly after the pandemic started, when there were all these supply chain shutdowns around the world. The government of Togo in Africa approached a group called NASA Harvest, which is NASA's food security arm run out of the University of Maryland. But it's a consortium of a bunch of different partners at universities, companies, and a few different government agencies. And the Ministry of Agriculture in Togo asked Harvest if they could make a map of all the cropland in the country to proactively distribute aid to farmers because they were worried that the supply chain shutdowns were going to lead to a ripple effect of food insecurity in the country. So they wanted to help farmers boost their domestic production. We worked with NASA Harvest almost 24/7 for 10 days. And then in 10 days, we're able to deliver these maps to the government. And they use that to distribute over 50,000 interest-free loans to smallholder farmers. And it was amazing to see research leading to action in the real world. And I think, especially when it comes to earth science and planetary science, you don't see that happen very often. Scientists are judged by, in terms of their career success, if you're working at a university, how many papers have you published that year? What is the so-called impact factor of the journal you're publishing in? So how prestigious is that journal? Things that don't necessarily translate to, did the work that you did actually have an impact in the real world? And especially when it comes to earth sciences, when we're dealing with a climate crisis, and like, especially in Canada, like Canada's literally on fire right now. It's very selfish of us as scientists to think that our responsibility stops at writing that paper. So I wanted to take inspiration from seeing these scientists working with the right partners in this case, government, but it could also be a nonprofit. It could be a community organization. It could be politicians, local stakeholders, to get the results of research implemented in the world somehow. You can also do that through commercialization. So did you invent an idea or a concept as a researcher that could, if you put it into the right hands, be commercialized into something that could solve a problem? So the goal with EPIC is to not have researchers that are judged by how many publications they're pumping out, but connecting them with the right people to figure out, what does your community actually need? What does the world need in terms of climate solutions, or innovating for the moon and Mars, or living on the space station, any of that kind of stuff, so that we can make sure that we're doing research that matters at the end of the day.
That's a great segue to the future of space exploration. We can talk about the Earth-bound problems, but they are extrapolations of space and the livability of it. So there's three areas of sustainability and equity and ethical considerations. So let's talk about sustainability. I have my own ideas, but I want to hear yours. Why is sustainability such a crucial aspect of space exploration?
So a big consideration is that I think on Earth, we are so used to having access to a ton of resources, whether
Right.
that is food or energy or people. And we lose all of that in space. Everything that you use is such a limited resource that needs to be replenished somehow, whether that is through some kind of in situ resource utilization if you're on a place like the moon or Mars, or if you're on a space station, you're sending that stuff up from Earth. There's a huge cost to that. So try to figure out, how can you live as sustainably as possible in the place where you are living? And can we take lessons from that and apply them back to Earth so that we can live more sustainably here and realize that, the sort of view that we have that the resources here are infinite, even though we know that they're not, we kind of live like they are in a lot of cases. And so shifting our mindset to think about these extremely constrained environments, like living on a space station or living on Mars, can help us approach these problems in a way that's a little more exciting and interesting to deal with them. I like to think of the example, since I used to work at ASU, Arizona State University. If you task somebody with designing a water reclamation system for Phoenix, they're probably not going to come up with as creative of ideas as if you say, design me a water reclamation system for Mars. But in both cases, you're dealing with a desert type climate. Mars is just a cold desert instead of a burning hot desert. But the scarcity of water is, a similar situation. But there's still way more water in Phoenix. So getting people to think in context of solving for space, it lets our imaginations run wild a little bit. And then we can take that and say, oh, that idea, we could actually apply that also somewhere here on Earth where we're running into a very similar or the exact same problem.
Yeah, I worked a lot with Singularity startups. They would come through their accelerator, and Singularity University had this program for a long time. And they would always be about their moonshots, right? And there were brilliant scientists and entrepreneurs, but they would have material scientists that would kind of, we're going to build habitats on Mars. And I said this on another podcast, but it's like, let's build them in Africa. It's like, let's tell you, you got to test it out here. But it also applies because if you can solve it here, there's maybe some modifications, but it does have, commercialization applicability on Earth. Well, you mentioned Mars and you mentioned the moon, you mentioned space station. Like, what do you think are the biggest challenges? Is it like, it sounds like it's recyclability, reclamation, and just recreation or creation, like, generation of something. Those are the three things that come to my mind,
Yeah. I mean, the moon, you're sort of lucky in that Earth is close enough by that you could send resources there that you can't get natively on the moon. It's just very expensive to do that. So how you want to define sustainability in terms of the moon could be a little variable. Do you need it to be everything that you can utilize on the moon, or is it okay to send some stuff from the Earth? When you look at Mars, though, that's far enough away and hard enough to get there in the grand scheme of things that it's not practical to have to keep sending shipments of food and water and oxygen. So we've started to do some experiments there for things like there's an instrument on the Perseverance rover called MOXIE, the Mars Oxygen In Situ Resource Experiment. I always forget what it stands for. It's an oxygen generator mounted on the rover. And it's meant to be a scale test of building larger versions of this experiment that pulls in carbon dioxide, pulls apart essentially the carbon and the oxygen, sequesters the carbon, and releases breathable oxygen back into the air. Mars also has a lot of water that we can utilize in terms of water in the atmosphere and water buried beneath the surface in the form of ice. There's massive ice deposits on Mars. So there's a lot more that we can take advantage of there compared to the moon. So I think a lot of the issues that we're going to run into are actually more social than technological. Social and biological. We only have a very limited amount of data in terms of how microgravity or low gravity affects the human body. We don't really have any data on how it would affect development of a child if you were trying to raise them in another environment, which would be pretty critical if we're going to live somewhere else beyond Earth as a species. We do a lot of experiments in analog habitats here on the Earth to understand what the social dynamics are in these isolated environments. But part of me feels like even if you were in this fake habitat, at the top of a volcano in Hawaii, pretending you're on Mars, there's still some part of you that has to know, I'm still on Earth, and if anything went wrong, we can call 911 or we can get out of this habitat. There's still a safety net there. But there's some point when you are on your way to Mars that if something goes wrong, there's nothing you can do. We don't have ships that can fly around like on Star Trek, right? So you're just stuck in this line in your sort of slingshot between the Earth and Mars, and you have to finish your journey. There's nothing you can do. So how would people respond to those kind of situations when it's literally life and death on the line and there's no one that can help you except for you? I mean, at some point, you're even too far away from Earth to have any real-time communication with anybody other than the people that are in your crew. And if you're talking early crews where it might be, 6, 10 people, if you only can talk to 6 to 10 people for 5 years of your life, like, I feel like you might go a little bit insane.
Yeah, it's kind of like having permanent roommates and you can't get away from them. Can't even go out,
Yeah.
the bar and, get some space. There's no alone time kind of really, unless it's a
Yeah.
really big spaceship. Yeah. So, what do you think of as you mentioned water on Mars? I've often wondered why we haven't sent probes to go below the aquifer, like real mining rigs to kind of get a better sense of site location where we can get water, you know what I mean? And then at the same time, like send I know they've built them, but like scramjet type of aircraft that can they can fly through the Martian atmosphere to start some type of LiDAR, kind of scanning the surface, like trying to figure out where there might be places to base. And maybe you have information on that. So, but I've wondered some of that because that's the huge aspect of sustainable, like you said, resources that you can't be shipping water, right?
Mhm.
What are your
Water
thoughts
is
on? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
water is really heavy too. So like
Yes.
we just don't want to have to deal with that. The nice thing is with Mars, we have 2 spacecraft in orbit that have ground penetrating radar on board. And so we've been able to use those. One is a European mission, Mars Express, and the other one is NASA mission, Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter.
Great.
And they've
That's
given
right.
us a really detailed picture of what the sort of deep subsurface looks like. So we're talking like tens to hundreds of meters down, which would be really easy for us to drill on the Earth, but that's really hard for us to do on Mars. You would need gigantic industrial equipment to be able to get that deep. So
Yeah.
we've sent some rovers that can scratch at the surface, like the Phoenix lander back in 2008, dug little trenches and exposed some ice there, which was our first real confirmation that there was ice so close to the surface. So there's plans now for a mission called Mars Ice Mapper that Canada is slated to build the main radar instrument for, because it's one of the things that like Canada's really known for in space is radar expertise. We have a whole constellation called RadarSat that images the Earth every day. So they want to take that heritage and send it to Mars. And that will tell us what sort of the upper 10 meters of the subsurface looks like. And we can figure out where is the shallow ice, the ice that would be easy in the relative sense for astronauts to get to. We can kind of guess where those places are based on, like, to use a technical term, morphology, the shapes of stuff on the surface, because ice leaves very characteristic features. So we could see things like old glaciers that have flowed on the surface of Mars, and they're not flowing anymore from what we can tell because it's so cold, but we can see just the shape of like, oh, this is a glacier. And then thanks to the radar data, we could confirm, oh, there's still ice in there. So we used a lot of that information to try to pick candidate human landing sites with SpaceX back in the day. They held these Mars landing site workshops where they invited a handful of Mars experts to come in for, I think we did it for 4 years. And each year there was a different focus area of what we would talk about. And a lot of human landing site selection and ice accessibility were big parts of this. And so if you search for the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter high-rise camera online, there are some photos that have the caption on them. It says like candidate SpaceX landing site or candidate human landing site, one of the two. Those areas will show you some of the icy spots that we kind of discussed as a group would be really great for humans to land at in terms of being able to dig down to that buried ice.
That's great. Like a lot of people are going to check that out because I didn't know, everything. You can't know everything. It's great to understand that. But, as a planetary scientist, when you look at Mars, what do you put in your best conjecture science with kind of cross it with science? Like, what do you think happened to Mars? What do you think the history of Mars has been? It's like, was it, I don't know, a couple million years ago? It was my theory is that it was oceans. It was more green. It had, I think there's something up with the core, like it lost its gravitational field, which makes, the people that want to terraform Mars, you kind of need gravity. You need you need to change the construct of the planet, to like really green, terraform it. But that's just my opinion. But because to have all that ice, to have these rivers, like it just seemed like there was something, and there's no, at least we can see, there's no evidence of like some extinction level event or some large set of asteroids that destroy, kind of killed but it just seemed like there's something that cataclysmic happened, like what it was before. I mean, what are your thoughts on it as a scientist? And what would you like to know once we kind of get there? What would you like to know?
Oh man, I want to know everything. But
it's big questions, right?
yeah. Well, I mean, we have a really good picture of kind of the evolution of Mars over time, thanks to the number of missions that we've sent there. So we know that early on in its history, it was very Earth-like. It was a lot warmer. It was wetter. We can see on the surface like ancient channels all over the place. We can see craters that used to be lakes. Two of the rovers are driving in those crater lakes right now, looking at rocks that tell us about the chemical composition of what the lakes would have been when the water was still there. So we know that all of this water also had the right chemical conditions for life to thrive. But it looks like somewhere around sort of 3.5 billion years ago, Mars started to make this shift from being a warm and wet planet to this cold polar desert that we see today. And it probably is tied to the core solidifying. So one of the big things that our liquid core here on Earth does is the sloshing around of all that liquid metal generates a protective magnetic field. Protects us from radiation, but it also protects the atmosphere from being stripped away into space. And at Mars, the hypothesis for a long time had been, well, it's a smaller planet. It cooled off faster since the formation of the solar system. And so as that happened, it lost its magnetic field. And so then the solar wind was able to just slowly start stripping the atmosphere away into space. That lowers the atmospheric pressure. It lowers the temperature. And so a lot of the water on the surface either just evaporated into space or permeated into the ground, into ice. And we can see that ice today. We were able to confirm that this is happening in about 2014, 2015 with NASA's MAVEN mission, which is specifically designed to study the atmosphere of Mars. So a lot of people probably haven't heard about it because it's not a mission that's taking cool pictures of the surface like we're used to seeing. It literally is just like measuring how much of the atmosphere is blowing away over time and taking some cool-ish UV images of the atmosphere, but not the kind of stuff that people usually tend to see in like press releases very much. And so with this mission, we were actually able to measure the atmospheric loss rate. So Mars is actually losing its atmosphere into space at a rate of about 1 kilogram or 2 every second. So the point that you made about terraforming is really important here. If you're going to try to terraform Mars in the sense that you want people to be able to live on the surface, without a spacesuit as if they were on Earth, you'd have to be generating your atmosphere at a faster rate than it is being lost to space. But that also means that atmosphere you're generating is now a non-renewable resource because the atmosphere of Mars is already very thin to begin with. It's kind of the equivalent of being at about 130,000 feet up here on the Earth. So higher than you could fly in an airplane, higher than you could breathe as a human, obviously. So there's still a lot of atmosphere. It would take a long time to deplete it. But again, we should be learning our lesson from here on Earth about non-renewable resources and be like, okay, if there's a way that we could do this more efficiently, that makes a lot more sense. So it makes much more sense on Mars to live in these habitats where you can be recycling the air, you can have CO2 scrubbers, you're just working with what you have. And that will be much more sustainable at the end of the day than trying to terraform the entire planet to, become Earth 2.0.
Well, it sounds like if it's losing the atmosphere, is there going to become a time where it becomes like there's nothing left? And it almost sounds like we have to, if we're going to have a long-term habitat, it's almost like we have to produce enough to keep it in a stabilized, but even if we're not terraforming it, which may come later if we have more resources to do it. But again, you're still going to be facing loss. It's like, you got to keep I was thinking of the cast iron stove. You got to keep that stoked in order to heat the house, right? It's like, you got to keep feeding it little bit of wood, right? How did that, I mean, it's not the way I would answer, but it sounds like it's going to be one to kind of maintain our livability because it could, when would the atmosphere be gone? Are we talking 100, like 1,000 years, 100,000 years, million years? Like it'll be just done as a planet?
That's a good question. It's probably like many, many millions of years down the line
Yeah.
in terms of like what's currently there. I haven't done the math, but now I'm curious to take a look. So it's not
Well,
something
there you
that we
go.
would
That's
be
what I
dealing
do.
with.
Give you some homework. So that's no, I think it's, because it makes me think of shows like The Expanse, right? Which is like,
Yeah.
they try to at least probably the most, I would say that's probably the show that's got the most practical use of physics and the realities of it versus like Firefly, which is near and dear to my heart as a show. But it's like, they terraformed a planet in like, 100 years or 50, like it doesn't work like that. So unless there's leaps of technology where we're not even talking about, I can get into, the opposite of that is the runaway of like Venus, which is kind of where, is with the Venus Foundation. I know that Guillermo and Rohan, which you've worked with and you've spoken at, how, is that kind of, will that ever cool down again? It's like, will that over passage of time, or is it going to is it going to go in the other direction? Cause it's close, is it the runaway greenhouse, or could we even cool it? Like, could we actually bombard it and try and cool it down? So not to say we're talking about bad sci-fi show, like movies like The Core or Snowpiercer or something. So, but like, could we try and do that to kind of affect its livability or usability for us beyond like floating platforms?
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly more resources to work with there in terms of the atmosphere.
Yeah.
And the way that Venus orbits, it kind of generates its own like weird induced magnetic fields. So it has some protection. But if you started trying to like thin out the atmosphere to make it so that humans could live on the surface, then you're going to lose some of that. So there's like all these different factors at play. And I think it's for any planet, whether it's Earth, Venus, Mars, I think that we haven't, as a species, truly appreciated how interconnected systems are as a whole. Like on Earth, our relatively new understanding of how important fungi and mycelial networks are to like the health of entire forests, or the role that certain types of bacteria play in our own bodies. Like these are things that we've only known about for a few years relative to like all of science that humans have been doing. And so actually the bacteria is something that comes up in some experiments on the space station now, is how does the microbiome in our body change in microgravity? Because that wasn't something that was really appreciated as being so impactful to how our body functions. And now we understand like bacteria might be related to, certain types of mental health issues. It's certainly related to a lot of gut issues in people. I think there was an ISS, International Space Station study, where they were looking at how your microbiome influenced your risk of developing certain types of cancers. So like there's so much interconnectedness in our ecosystem that we don't understand very well yet. And so for me, I'd say that's one of my personal biggest arguments against terraforming in the near term is we don't even understand how all this stuff works here. So if we start going and trying to figure out, like just playing like we know what's going on another planet, it feels like a potential recipe for disaster. But, it could also be a safer place for us to practice some of that kind of stuff before we try to do, if we got to a point on Earth where we needed really radical geoengineering to combat climate change, she'd practice in the atmosphere of Venus, like maybe less consequential than trying to do that here.
Well, and it's like, we know we're talking about terraforming. It's like, it's not that we know that anybody lives there, but it's like, it brings up the issues of ethics, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you think about how we advance in space exploration, what ethical issues do you believe need more attention? I mean, there's things on here on Earth, but just things to consider, with ethics.
Yeah, I think a couple of big ones that I think about quite a bit, at least, are as a geologist, but I know that this is also really aligned with a lot of indigenous worldviews too, is that, we talk about these other planets like we have some inherent right to change them to suit us. And it's a very like human-centric view. At the same time, for me as a geologist looking at Mars, the question that comes to my mind is, well, doesn't Mars have a right to exist as a place that was never designed for us to live there? Like we probably like evolved on this planet. Maybe there was some panspermia going on. We don't really know. But regardless, like we are very much designed to live here. And so is it right for us to just assume that anything else we come across is there for us to change to suit our needs, to extract the resources for us to use? I think in my mind, there's a little bit of a difference between going somewhere to live there and utilizing the resources to live there versus the idea of, say, extracting resources from another place to come back and use it on Earth. Because I think that's when we start to hit the antithesis of sustainability. Like if our species has gotten to a point where we require the resources of other planets and asteroids to sustain our lifestyle, that like, I feel like that's something where we need to sit down and have some serious reflection on like, okay, what could we be doing to not require that? But at the same time, does that limit our development as a species? So it's really tricky. The other side of it, I think, kind of ties back to what we were talking about earlier in taking into account multiple worldviews. There was some controversy pretty recently with a commercial lunar mission that was carrying human remains on board. That mission didn't end up making it to the lunar surface, but the Navajo Nation kind of protested to NASA saying, hey, you said that you were going to consult us about like cultural viewpoints when it came to utilization of the moon, and you didn't talk to us about this. And NASA's response was like, the quote that I saw was almost verbatim, like, well, this is a commercial mission, so we don't have any control over what they do on the moon. And technically that's true. That kind of regulation doesn't come from NASA. That comes from like there's a commercial regulation group like in the government that deals with that stuff. But the general public doesn't know that. Like in general, people think space, they think of NASA. So I think that the answer to that question could have been handled a little bit better. But it does raise the question of, the moon as a public good and like part of human history, human religion, mythology, like all this kind of stuff. And suddenly we're at a point where it could potentially turn into the Wild West. Like anybody that can get there can do whatever they want. And some of this is what inspired, I think people will only hear the audio of this and not see video, but next to me is a book that I wrote called For All Humankind with my friend Danny Bednar.
This is video and audio. There'll be a video. There's a video version.
Okay.
The people are watching now as they see. So, but yeah, nice. The audio will be out, but yeah, there's the books behind you. Your book For All Humankind. Yeah, that book is, you want to talk about that book behind you?
Yeah. So the inspiration here was to hear stories from people who watched or listened to the Apollo 11 moon landing live as it happened, but were not people involved in space. We've heard the stories all the time about people that got inspired by Apollo when they went on to become engineers or planetary scientists, astronauts. I wanted to know, how did this moment in human history impact everybody else? And specifically, not just people that didn't go into space as a career, but people that were not from the US or the USSR. So people that were not invested in the space race from a political standpoint. And I wanted to see, like, what was this broader cultural impact? Did people see this as a human achievement or an American achievement? Did they feel inspired the way that the dialogue in America tends to be around Apollo? Like, was that inspiration a global thing? And the stories were remarkably consistent. Like the people that we talked to range from, a woman who was a 5-year-old girl in rural India at the time to a 44-year-old Holocaust survivor from Lithuania who had, after the war, immigrated to South Africa, saw stuff was not going well there politically. He's like, I know where this goes. And he immigrated to Canada. And then you have a bunch of other like age ranges and countries in between. And just the consistency of all these people saying like, this was something that we thought was going to bring humanity together. We had a brighter view of the future because of this. Multiple people were like, I felt like I was a part of this, even though they had no personal connection to the United States or the space race or space at all. So that gives me so much like hope and like a lot of heartwarming feelings to see like, okay, we were able at one point to bring everybody together, united around this idea of humans going into space and doing something bigger than ourselves, bigger than like a single country, bigger than just the ideas of like the minutia of Earth. And so I think people want to be engaged in that conversation. They want to think about like, what will this look like as humans go back into space? So making sure that we have ways for those voices to be heard, and we actually, do more than give the lip service of saying, yeah, okay, you wrote us a report or you sent us some comments. That's great. What can we actually do to make sure that we listen to these other voices and then take that stuff into account in the planning? That I think is the harder part. And I'm not sure. I don't have a great answer as to how to fix that part, because we're not doing a great job of incorporating all the voices to begin with just yet.
Yeah, I want to touch on that in a second. It reminds me of at the Kennedy Space Center in the museum, there are where you have the bottom of the Saturn V. You can see how big it is. There's front pages from all over the world. I use my Google Translate to see them, and you can see, we the landing, how much the global event that it was, and what. So I think there's two facets to it. I think there's one, the humanity aspect, and two, the military industrial complex aspect, or the superpower dominance aspect, which you can see in the For All Mankind, which is an excellent show if you all haven't seen it. I assume probably most listeners have, but it's if the Soviets landed on the moon first and the space race never stopped. And it's amazing to see what kind of would have maybe played out. The humanity, I think it was a shared experience. No matter who you were, I think at that level of achievement and as a human race, there's unique things that bring us together as humanity. I think it's there, and I think it's a shame there wasn't more of a quest to kind of go further, but that ties it to the second part, which is the superpower dominance. The real reason it kind of went, because it was viewed as a threat of dropping missiles from space, or communications, or just another, constantly the Cold War turning to a hot war, the Third World War. And it was interesting, is like, well, just because you landed on the moon, is it really over? So did it just kind of like when, you cross the ticker tape and you stop? I also think that it's come out now too, is the Russians' technology they might have gotten the leg up on the early stuff, but the real complexities, if you look at if anybody studied the Apollo program, it's a perfect example of when we build things today and you iterate on it, right? They did, and you're seeing this even with Spaceship One, right? It's like they get up into orbit and they figure that part out. Then they do a spacewalk. Then they connect the LEM, and they do these. Your last thing is actually, they go to the moon, but they circle it. They come back. So they don't just like go. The Russians just wanted to like shoot it into space and go. And I think that was the biggest fundamental engineering difference in the approach to it. And many people in the Soviet side is, Apollo 1 we lost, but a lot of people died trying that approach. And you talked about the aspect of more people travel. We have the new programs for the astronauts, but that's just not going to be enough. How can we get how can we ensure that this benefits all of humanity? Like, how can we get people into being a part of this more? Like, I stray away from the inclusivity words or diversity. It's just about people that really want to be a part of this and really participate. What do you think are things we can do over the next decade to really kind of change the game? Because you're going to need a lot of people. You're going to need lawyers. You're going to need, entrepreneur. You're gonna need all kinds of people, not just, scientists and test pilots, right? What are your thoughts on that?
I think like the stuff you just listed off is really important in terms of helping people realize that being involved in the space program is far beyond just being an astronaut or just being one of those people in mission control with the headset on. I think that's what people obviously think of when you think of space. I remember when I was a kid, one of my parents kind of discouraged me from studying space like in university, because they're like, well, you're never going to be an astronaut, so that's going to be useless. I'm really glad that turned out to not be the case. But it's true, I would not have been able to be an astronaut for many reasons, partly because I am too short to be an astronaut. Although maybe that's different now with commercial astronauts. But anyway, yeah, there's so many ways to be involved in the space sector. And even just 10 years ago, the opportunities were so much more limited. There were, corporate lawyers and accountants and admin folks at, the big prime companies and at places like NASA. But now you have so many companies out there. Like we have graphic designers in the field. There's a few people online that are really well known for just being launch photographers. Like that is their role. They work for Rocket Lab or they work for SpaceX and they photograph the launches. Like I feel like that would have been my other dream job if I hadn't done Mars rovers, like just data photograph launches. How cool is that? You have salespeople. You have, I'm trying to think of like, basically at some point, everything that we have on Earth, we're going to need in space. Medical doctors, veterinarians. At some point, I'm sure people are going to want to be like, hey, if I'm going to a space hotel, I'd love to bring my dog with me. So figure out if we can do that. And really making sure that people understand, like, I feel like a lot of people kind of exclude themselves pretty early on, because I run into this all the time when I talk to people. They're like, oh yeah, I loved space, but I wasn't good at math. And so I didn't try to pursue it as a career. Or, I didn't really think I'd be a very good engineer. So I went into some completely unrelated fields. I did terribly in calculus in college and I still got to work on Mars rovers. So I'm sure teachers hate it when I say that to their classrooms, but I want people to understand, like, just because you work in the space program doesn't mean you're some kind of super genius. Like by portraying it as this idea that it's like a bunch of really smart people, they're mostly just really passionate. That's not to say that people are dumb, but I think like we attach this level of intelligence to the whole field that on the one hand is kind of cool if people are like, oh my God, you must be so smart. But on the other hand, I think it, scares some people away if they feel like they're not smart enough to be involved. And I think space is really unique in that it is a group of such passionate people. I feel like that level of excitement about your job and like living what you do, I don't see that in a lot of other fields. Like it's a special place to be. And so trying to get more people to be a part of that vision and mission and like want to be part of crafting the future for humanity, I think like we should be doing everything we can to encourage people to be involved if they want to, in whatever way they can or want to contribute.
Yeah, and it's not, and this segues to kind of the working in the business of space. Is that space is not just an industry; it's a place. You talked about the resources, and I kept thinking about a like intergalactic manifest destiny. It's like trying to feeling like you need to capture those, but the business of space is always fascinated me as an entrepreneur, as a just someone in this, wanting to be that astronaut, not strong with STEM, not strong with math, right? We will need artists. We will need people to capture the beauty of humanity. I mean, that's hopefully something I can do. It's what I'm trying to do with this podcast is capture the voices in this, that are helping, bring us off world. Right. And, there's two roles I think that I want to explore with you is one as a scientist, the other is kind of the consultant. Right. So as a scientist, you talked about the Mars rover and working on those projects. What's it like to be a missions operations specialist, like working in space? Like, what is it like to do that kind of job? What's a day in the life? First, like, what is the job? And like, what is a day in the life? Is it just getting coffee, staring at screens? Like, what is the work? I think it would be really helpful for people that, they kind of try and imagine. And I think it's a bit far out of their mental models to know what it is about. So
yeah, I mean, it's very unique, right? So people ask a lot of the time. I remember at one point, somebody was saying, oh, you should have a live stream camera that's set up in mission control for Curiosity, I think it was. And I kind of laughed and I was like, oh, you'd probably be really bored watching it because, we're not sitting there driving the rover with a joystick or anything like that. The time delay between Earth and Mars is too big. So it's very different doing operations for a satellite versus a rover. But for the rovers, it's sort of this daily thing. It's very routine. Like you would come in the morning and you basically package up all the commands that you want the rover to do for a single day and send them all at once. And then you wait for the commands to execute. The rover generally sends the data back to one of the satellites in orbit, and then those satellites in orbit of Mars, and then those satellites will send it back to the Earth. So when you come in the morning, like for me, for Opportunity, for example, I was the payload downlink lead for the pan cams, like the color eyes of the rover. So my job would be to come in the morning, pull down all the images that had come back from Mars overnight on Earth, and then step through those images and look at them both from the standpoint of kind of an engineer, like is the camera functioning properly, looking at all the telemetry data that came in along with it to see if it's operating within the right temperatures. Did it do everything we asked it to do? Because it was so late in the Opportunity mission at that point. The rover was not fully functional. Sometimes it would have what we called amnesia events. So like you would ask it to take 15 images and it might take 7 of them. And so you'd check and see which ones came back and which ones didn't, and then kindly ask the rover to do the missing ones. And then you'd also look at the images from the standpoint of a geologist. Is there anything in this image that's telling me something important about the history of Mars, telling me something that we should be connecting with one of the other instrument teams on board to say, like, hey, could we shoot this rock with the one of the spectrometers, or should we drive closer to this rock and take some closer images, stuff like that. And then there's a lot of teleconferences where like all the different teams are sitting there. We're debating about like which targets we want to look at, what to do that day. And you're basically arguing over every single watt of power, because the power determines everything that we can do on Mars. We're so power constrained compared to doing stuff on Earth. With satellites, the power is not so much an issue because we've got these big solar panels. But in both cases, we're really limited by downlink. So how much data can we send back between Earth and Mars? When Mars is really close, I'm trying to remember what a data rate might be. Generally speaking, like an average data rate between Earth and Mars would be on par with a dial-up modem. So we are limited in the amount of data we can collect and send back. So as a mission operations person, a lot of what you're doing is planning around the available downlink for that week, depending on how close Earth and Mars are to each other, and doing a lot of data triage. Like, okay, if the mission were to die tomorrow, because you always have to operate under that assumption, what is the most important thing for you to accomplish today in terms of science, in terms of tactical goals when it comes to the rover, and in terms of like taking certain things into account, like what time of year is it? What does the shadowing look like? You don't want to take a picture of something if it's going to be in deep shadow and you can't see your feature of interest. So planning around all those things, there's a lot of different factors to take into account. I think people probably assume the satellites are just orbiting and like taking pictures of whatever's beneath them, because that's what we do a lot on the Earth with things like Landsat from NASA. But on Mars, because of this limitation of how much data we can send back, having a human in the loop to make those decisions is really critical from a science standpoint.
It's, that's great. And it kept prompting me to ask you about, the consulting side of this, where you are kind of now, right? It's like, Epic, I was fascinated by this as someone who builds products. Like Epic offers science as a service, a new kind of SaaS. It's like instead of software as a service, it's, can you explain that in a bit more detail? Like that would be, it's trying to kind of, for those might see the term or hear like, what does that mean? It seems like it's a new version, unless it's, I can't find any reference. So could you go into that in a little more detail?
Yeah. I mean, it's basically what kind of the way you just put it, like it's a fancier way to say consulting. But the idea is that usually science is driven by like a particular government grant program or a particular space mission, and there's money attached to being able to do research with the data from that mission. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that type of research has a practical real world application. Like a lot of that stuff is funded for scientists to write papers. And that's still important. Like I'm not trying to bash fundamental research. That's very important, but that's something universities are really good at. Universities are not very good at operating at a pace that is useful to industry. I interviewed a bunch of different CEOs and CTOs and other leadership folks at different companies. about trying to work with universities and what the pain points were. And the common theme that came up was, they're just not fast enough. There's too many competing priorities when you're trying to work with students and professors because they have 1,000 other things on their plates. So the idea behind creating this independent institute that is not affiliated with the university is you can have people that are tasked to do scientific research for R&D purposes with government partners, with industry partners, and you can do it as fast as they need it to go because you don't have a grad student that's also trying to write their thesis at the same time, or a professor that is also bogged down with a ton of administrative duties for their department. These are just people that are going to do the science that needs to be done to be applied in the real world. The flip side to that is that means you need somebody coming in to do this work with a bit of a different mindset. It's not going to be the type of scientist that's looking to become, the world leading expert in like a hyper niche research area. You are coming in knowing that this is more of an applied research type focus at the end of the day. But I think people just really want to be motivated by a vision a lot of the time. And especially if you have become a scientist, like I think you just want to do research. I don't think everybody goes into it wanting to become, some prestigious tenured professor somewhere, because there are a lot of downsides to academia too, like beyond being overloaded. That could be its whole podcast in its own, so we won't get into that. But if you've ever been in academia, you know. So trying to create a new pathway that is like, a different place and a different way of doing science so that it's more beneficial for getting stuff out in the real world. Like that's the goal at the end of the day.
It's great. So what's one question you wish people would ask you about your work? Like, and how would you answer?
Oh man. I'm trying to think of something I wish they would ask that people don't ask. Cause I feel like in general, people ask really good questions. I think one that I do get asked a lot, but I think is important for people to ask and for us to talk about is the why. Why are we doing all this in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
You get that common question of like, why are we spending money on space when there's so many problems here on the Earth? But one, it's because they don't necessarily see a direct application. One, even if we stop spending money on space tomorrow, it would not solve most of the problems that we have here on the Earth because our problems are social. They're kind of endemic because we as a species are just not good at cohabitating with each other a lot of the time. So how do we fix that? Again, that could be a whole other podcast on its own. But
I've always said like aliens don't want anything to do with us because we're a backwater planet that just engages in tribal warfare. So we're kind of, we split the atom, but hey, we're kind of, and is it in our nature to always be that, if you don't know, we don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like, we keep creating science fiction where we hope that like an alien species, like in Star Trek, it's the Vulcans, comes down and unites us. It's like, oh, there's something bigger than just us. And like, that's the thing that'll be the catalyst. It's like, well, could we do that without the aliens? Like, why can't we just figure out how to be better as a species on our own? Like, let's just try a little bit harder. But I think like separate from all of the kind of practical answers that people in the space industry tend to give about like, spin-off technologies or how much you use satellite data in your day-to-day life through GPS or, the weather app and stuff like that. The real fundamental thing behind a lot of this, at least when you're talking to a scientist, why are you doing this? It's because we want to answer that question of whether or not we're alone in the universe. And I think Mars is a particularly good example of this because we know that it used to be very Earth-like at the same point in the history of the solar system as the time that life arose on Earth. So if you have two planets that are right next to each other in the same solar system with the right conditions for life as we know it to thrive, and you had life on both planets and then life on Mars died off because it's turned into this very inhospitable place we see today, that seems like kind of an expected answer. Like, okay, we now know there's a sample set of 2 of what it takes for life to thrive, and maybe it's just fragile enough that's like changing the parameters to the point of Mars was like too fast or too much for life to survive. But I think the more interesting answer would be if we keep looking on Mars and we find out that Mars never had life. again, two planets right next to each other in the same solar system with the same conditions, tells us that something really special happened here that didn't happen on Mars. So what was that? Like, what happened here that doesn't seem to have happened anywhere else in our solar system to make Earth so special? So even though we're going to all these other planets and moons and we're studying exoplanets and studying the stars, at the end of the day, it's to put humanity and Earth in the context of the universe and to understand our own existence. That's hard to quantify as like an economic benefit or a technology spinoff because it's not. I think it's totally okay for us to say that we are doing this because we want to understand the universe. And people want to understand. They ask questions about this constantly. Every time I give a talk, or you see comments on YouTube videos about, big existential things for the universe. This is something that people are curious about, whether they're 5 or 105. They want to understand where we came from and what else is out there. And I think that that's beautiful.
And, it ties into like, as your work goes forward, what are your long-term goals, like taking that perspective of like for EPIC and your research? Like, what are you going to be focusing on to support that?
I think for me, the two big things that I've been really focused on, I've kind of mentioned them already, but getting science out into the world, because I think then people will have a better understanding and appreciation for what research can do, and hopefully try to break down some of these perceptions of, research in the academic sense being this ivory tower that isn't, a place for everybody to inhabit. I think it's important to have as many people participating in the scientific process as want to be, because asking more questions and getting more perspectives does nothing but good when it comes to trying to do research. And then that kind of ties to the greater overall vision of getting more people involved in helping us create this journey and craft the vision of humans as we move into, our next level, becoming an interplanetary species. How do we get people to want to be involved in that, to feel like they're a part of it, to feel like their voices are being heard, and that they want to participate in that process, and not just viewing it as something where, oh, I'm not smart enough, or I'm not rich enough, or whatever their perception might be as to what it means to explore space. How can we break down those barriers and try to recapture more of that Apollo era spirit, which I feel like we've lost in society today. Just there's so many other things going on. It's hard to get people united around something, and certainly for more than 5 seconds in someone's attention span. But I feel like we did it before, and that was sort of the takeaway message in like writing the Apollo book was, we've done this before. So I feel like that means we as a species have the capability to do this again.
That's a great kind of segue into kind of the future of human space settlement, because I agree with you. I mean, if you understand generational theory, or you kind of subscribe to that kind of work, we're in a crisis period. It was started in around 2008. Probably take 20, probably another couple years, and then we go into a new cycle, kind of like the way the 50s, kind of that excitement, that, newness, the fresh, kind of the spring, if you will, versus this winter. And I think that changes things are a lot of kind of like the new institutions have formed, the new kind of way of the world order, not conspiratorial, just the way the world will be, say, for the next, 100, 200 years. With that kind of positivity coming back, and probably the excitement of going to Mars and getting everybody kind of re-engaged that way, and kind of making it more social, more engaged. Like you said, like people in the neighborhood and people talked about it, but like real global communicate, like sharing this experience as a humanity, I think that's exciting. And it's a different way we can do it. And even just having, interviews with the astronauts as they go, right? It's just, there's such a difference. But like, let's go 50 or 100 years out. What do you envision like the human space settlement, and that kind of, what do you think will kind of, just in generalities, what do you think if we are able to re-engage, or just what do you think the play is, not apart from the Vulcans, which is supposed to happen in 2063? But, I don't want that one because that means world war. That means decimated planet. I'm good. Like, so what do you think the world will, what do you think things will be like?
I think this is going to sound like a cop-out answer, but I think it's going to be hard for us to predict when it comes to space, because I don't think that 10, 15 years ago, we would have adequately predicted where space is right now. Just the advents that we've seen from things like SpaceX launching and landing at like a weekly or sub-weekly cadence, the number of companies that have just, I feel like I should use the word exploded in this context, but I mean it in a good way. And they're building entire constellations of satellites that can just like do all sorts of stuff in Earth orbit. And now we have companies that are focused on Mars and Venus and going back to the moon. And so like we went from a period where it didn't feel like a whole lot was happening. It's just kind of like, oh, the shuttle's launching back to the space station again. Like people didn't really care all that much unless they were already a space nerd. So getting to a point now where like there's a renewed excitement about the fact that there's so much happening in space feels really positive. So I think if things keep going on this upward trajectory of, more frequent launches, more companies are popping up, we're seeing investment from countries around the world forming new space agencies, which is really incredible. Like my hope is that, we will see a sustained human presence on the moon within 50 years. I think we'll probably start to see, at the very least, like a scientific outpost on Mars, maybe something kind of akin to what we've got in Antarctica. Whether that's long enough for us to have like full on, cities, I think the skeptical part of me thinks that's a little too soon. Because like the old view would have been, well, we need like a lot of political backing and government money to make that happen. But now you have billionaires that are funding this kind of stuff. And I feel like that really changes the game too. Elon Musk does everything that he does because, regardless of what your opinions are of him, like he is genuinely focused on that goal of wanting to go to Mars and starting all these other companies and all these things he does in service to that goal that he has. And that's just something that governments don't have the ability to do. Like they can't maintain good focus, generally speaking, across different administrations. Everybody wants to have their own vanity project, especially when it comes to space. So these space billionaires have kind of opened up a new lane for stuff to happen. Like they can keep a focused goal and funnel as many of their resources as they want to into making these things happen. And so that, like as a whole, has probably been really good for reinvigorating the space sector. So are we going to see more people doing that? Are we going to see like the legacy of some of these people carry on? Like, if people like Musk and Bezos are dead in 50 years or when they die, like what happens to those companies?
Or we have life extension and they live, they can live 500 years, right?
That's true. Yeah. Isn't Bezos investing in that kind of stuff too? Maybe he'll figure that out.
I just keep thinking of Altered Carbon, where you have meths, which are like Methuselah's, like the rich live forever. And yeah, so I think you're exactly right. You're the first person I've interviewed that really gets, I call it, he's building the complete ecosystem to go to Mars, but he's proven it out. Like there's people that want tunnels, to transport you in the city of Los Angeles, or there's, Starlink for people here on Earth, like X is all these things. Everything he does is, like you said, in service. He is creating essentially like the robots. They're going to be the cheap labor to do things on Mars, right? The dangerous stuff too. It's all there. It doesn't, Earth is the way that makes money and gets it funded and gets investors in, but the real outcome, the long game, is Mars, right? Yeah, I agree. You have a very good sense of things. I think you're right about the research stations, the moon base. Yeah, I think that's true. It's been it's as we kind of start to kind of close this conversation, I want to have you back because there's so many other things rich things we can dive into. But I'd love to kind of do a little bit of our rapid fire. One of the things that I like to ask people, and there's a lot of different questions, but you talked about your book. Like, what is one book that's really profoundly influenced your thinking? about the future? What has it really impacted you?
About the future. It's not a book about space, but it's called, I always forget the subtitle. It's like Wayfinding the Art and Science of How Humans Navigate the World, or something to that effect in the subtitle. It's a book that goes into both the history and the neuroscience of how humans interact with the world around them through like on the ground exploration in 3 different cultures and looking at like the historical ways of navigating. So one was Polynesian seafarers, one was indigenous communities in the Canadian Arctic, and the other one was Aboriginal communities in Australia. And looking at how the way that these different cultures navigate impact your brain, and like how all of our senses are incorporated into how we experience the world. Like that book fundamentally changed the way that I interact with the world around me. Like I very rarely wear headphones when I go for walks now, because it talked about the impact of like the sounds around us and how that helps things better imprint into our limbic system, basically for memory. Smells of things really imprint on our memory. And so seeing how much the multisensory experience impacts our memory and navigation and just emotion in general got me really thinking about how is the sensory deprived environment of being in space or living in a habitat on the moon or on Mars, like how is that going to impact our brains and the way that we interact with the world? It really got me thinking. I feel like I rave about that book to people constantly. If you want to maybe change your perspectives on the world, I highly recommend it.
It's a great recommendation. Yeah, what's the one thing you've learned in your career that you wish you knew when you started?
I wish I knew that if I wanted to work on Mars rovers, I should have studied engineering and geology rather than going into astronomy at the beginning. I don't regret it, but it would have been a more direct path.
That's good. Well, what advice would you give those who are starting out, like the thinkers, innovators, who want to make that impact? Like, what advice would you give them?
I would say go for it. Like the space community is so enthusiastic and generally really supportive and like, all nerds on board kind of thing. So find your way in. Yeah. Find your way in, find your people, like start building that community and, chase that goal because it's worth it. It's the thing that's going to make you happy at the end of the day.
So how would you, this legacy question I always love to ask people, because it's, even if you're young and early in your career, but how would you want your work to be remembered? Like, what impact do you hope it has on the world?
I really like helping other people find opportunities, especially students, and then kind of watch them grow into their dream careers. I find that really rewarding. Maybe that's the part of me that was meant to be a professor. I don't know. So I think I would like to be remembered for helping to create opportunities for other people, to like really grow the number of people that we see in space and the impact that those people are having, because they can do more than just one person.
That's great. So it's kind of like, so how do people, stay updated with your work, the developments with Epic, and just your research in general? So like all the things about you, like how people can connect with you.
I'm really easy to find on pretty much any social media platform is at Tanya of Mars, Tanya. So my website, tanyaharrison.com. And if you have questions that you want answered, we'll say about Mars, but you can put other stuff in there too. I have a forum at askthemartian.com. And I'm going to start using those questions to create some video content. It's been up for a little while. I haven't done it yet because I've been in like nomad mode, but once that is over, I can start digging into people's questions. So definitely looking forward to seeing what people submit there.
That's great. Well, thank you for being on the show, and it's been a pleasure to learn about you and your journey. So thanks a lot.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Going Off World. You can find us on all the major podcast platforms and at www.goingoffworld.com, as well as on YouTube under Going Off World. See you next time.